Hi folks, welcome to the latest episode of Political Frenemies. We'll introduce our guest in just a moment, but I'm Mathew Hulbert. I'm a Lib Dem activist, former Lib Dem councillor, and of course I'm joined by my fellow co-host Chris Newton, Dr. Chris Newton no less, PhD, not medical, former Tory defence policy advisor and academic. Chris, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Yeah, lots of news, lots of political news, lots of international news. I'm having difficulty keeping up with everything, especially with all of the activity that Russia's been doing over the past couple of weeks. But apart from that, apart from being exhausted from all of that, I'm good.
Excellent. Yeah, the news just doesn't slow down, does it? We think sometimes it's going to be a slow week, and it's yet to happen. So, and we're joined by, and we're really thrilled to be joined by Kevin Foster, who was Conservative MP for Torbay from 2015 to last year, held numerous positions in government, Minister of State for Transport in 2022, Under Secretary of State for Safe and Legal Migration in the Home Office 2019 to 2022. Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Wales in 2019. So lots of ministerial experience. And so, Kevin, great to have you on. You're our first former or current MP, former or current government minister to be on the pod. So I mean, that's a bit of a breakthrough for us, which is fantastic. But me and you know each other of old, don't we? Do you want to tell our viewers and listeners a bit about that?
Yeah, we do, Matthew. This might be a first time in some ways, but it's certainly not in many others. It's a bit of a blast for the past really, because I remember about 20 years ago, a journalist for a radio station in Coventry regularly interviewing me and emailing me in my then role as deputy leader of Coventry City Council and being a cabinet member for that. So it's great to see how you've moved on, Matthew. You've done different things in your careers, and I'm delighted when I got the invite to come on and support this initiative.
And it must have been you, Kevin, that inspired me when my time in kind of regular journalism came to an end in 2009 to go off and join the Liberal Democrats.
Well, that's something. Perhaps it was the coalition coming up that made you so inspired. But there we go. I know your views on that one as well. But,
indeed. It's just fantastic to have you on, and it's really good of you to agree, because we're still a growing podcast and becoming better known as time moves on, which is fantastic. But so we'll talk a bit about your time in government in a sec. But how's being a post MP? What do you do with your life now? What's happening?
Well, it's a bit different, and there's no set formula. Okay, some people who perhaps are decided what they're going to retire. Other people might already be in the sort of position where they'd end up going into the House of Lords, and others might just return to what they were doing previously. For example, a lot of colleagues who are medically qualified will keep working enough during their time as an MP to ensure their professional qualifications are still valid. So for them, there's quite a set path. For someone like me, it's a bit different. It's been 20 years since I've practiced criminal law, and I've been in local government, as you know. So it was a bit more find my own way of what I wanted to do. And the House of Commons gives you a bit of advice and stuff like that, but I'd say it's more on the basis of ensuring you're all right mentally and you're not getting depressed and all that, rather than, let's say, really, really solid career advice. So I just started picking up some media stuff. Do work with GB News. People see me on that one. Do some consultancy work. But I think, a lot of it, and this must say it's not unwelcome that I don't sit up till midnight doing emails pretty much every night anymore. But it's very much what you make of it after you come out. And ironically, I'm actually doing a lot more national media now than I ever did when I was in Parliament. I think some of that's because you do feel that bit freer to say exactly what you think, particularly if you've been a long period of time in government, sit as a government minister, and you can now go out and say pretty much what you want within reason, and that obviously makes you a more interesting commentator, because you can talk about what's likely to be on a Home Office minister's desk, what's likely to be thinking about and kicking around in Number 10 as news stories come through. So yeah, that's what it is. Still live in Torquay, still do some campaigning, but when I go in the national media, I sometimes have to explain, but I'm not going in to act as a Conservative Party spokesperson, so I one interview the other day who was very keen, basically wanted me to sort of defend Kemi for 5 minutes. And I just said, well, I'm happy to talk about the issue, but I'm not really here to talk about Kemi Badenoch. Take on the issue. That's perhaps one for, get a shadow minister on for that one. So, that's the sort of thing I'm doing. And, a few other interests, do a bit of work with the Royal British Legion, unpaid, I have to say, that is voluntary. And always happy to support them, and have helped with a couple of community groups. People still come for advice and help, and where I can, I will. But obviously, I can't pick up the casework in the way I did as an MP.
And I don't quite know how to phrase this question. I mean, I think people have an idea that, once you've been an MP, you're kind of set for life financially and no worries. I mean, that's not really the case, is it, for everyone that leaves the Commons?
No, not at all, actually, Matthew. There are people, and without going into any details of individuals, who are struggling post-Parliament, particularly those who hadn't been there that long. Particularly those perhaps who are single or perhaps have been divorced during their times. As you'll know, in all parties, parliamentarians have an extremely high divorce rate. People think it's a nice job. You get weeks off in summer. Well, there's lots more late nights, unpredictable commitments, and that can take its toll. So, I was lucky, Hazel, my wife, we always work together on things. And the person who'd always been my best financial advisor, sadly now I have to manage his affairs. He's been in a nursing home for 3.5 years. He wouldn't be able to give me too much advice now, but I always followed my old man's advice. And he always used to say, whenever you can, overpay your mortgage. Because when you need to, if ever you need to, a conversation with your bank when you're 2-3 years ahead is very different to a conversation with your bank if you're 2 to 3 days behind.
Right. Chris?
No, it's really, really great to see you, and really good to see that you're doing lots of things outside after Parliament. So that's really good. Just moving on to your sort of experience as an MP and as a minister, I just wondered if you could give us a bit of a snippet as to sort of life, your experience there, and I think you served in the Transport, Home Office and Welsh Office sort of departments.
Yeah, I did the Cabinet Office and Whips.
And the Cabinet, yeah. I just wondered what were some of the highlights of working in government, and what were some of the lowlights and the challenges of working in government as well?
I think highlights were being able to do things, influence things, get things done. And also, by the way, for constituency, because one of the things that people perhaps don't see is because ministers can only speak on their brief in Parliament, there's other ways of picking up issues with colleague ministers on behalf. And, you do get stuff done in a way that you can't, you'll be starting to see that with certain Labour constituencies, that things will start happening that might not have done, but for the person concerned being in government. I think it was Andrew Stevenson who once did a very good summary of his constituency where it always had a Labour backbencher versus Jack Straw's just down the road. And funnily enough, Jack Straw's just down the road had done a lot better out of a Labour government than the one that had just had a backbench Labour MP. Surprise, surprise. So it's quite, that's the good bit. You get to do things that some people would be terrified by question time. I used to love it. It was good. The time, I must say, certain times when, you were doing stuff, you get stuff done. What were lows? I think certainly the frustrating times when, there would be people who would send you letters in the morning saying, particularly in immigration, saying, we should have less immigration. Oh, a lot less immigration. And in the afternoon, you get the letter saying, I've met this company and they can't recruit X. You should create a visa for that. And you think, right, great, okay, so we're going to cut immigration and we're going to create a new visa. Good, thanks for that. So you get some of those things, or where you'd be dealing with, let's say, issues that were quite difficult. You couldn't talk about everything you were doing. Certainly Home Office, because you have a crossover with national security as well in virtually every brief you do, that would be difficult. And sometimes you do some really good, really thoughtful media work and interviews. And, people would push you hard and you think, yeah, they're really pushing hard. And other times you do one where the presenter concerned had not really looked up the subject. They'd got a line. They were just going to throw it at you. And I can remember, one of the reasons I was pleased Newsnight redid its format was I can remember doing it when I was in immigration, and basically the line was, why wasn't I giving butchers visas? Emily Matus was pursuing. I just said, yeah, they qualify for skilled worker visas. So why were you refusing to give butchers visas? We went around this loop for about 2 minutes. But she hadn't challenged at all the sector, and the NFU had just been on before me about, okay, so why do you think you can't recruit? Is it purely the lack of a visa? What's your salary? How does that compare to other jobs? None of that. It was all going to be a visa that solved. So stuff like that was the most frustrating and low. And also, when we were going through the pandemic, that was difficult. When you're there, sat there with some of the early projections of what potential death tolls can be, that was pretty sobering. And seeing the impact and knowing what that meant. Those were some of the points that were more challenging and more difficult. And, it's very easy for people to look out the back window and say, oh, you could have done this, or you might have done that, or perhaps we should have done this. Yeah, great, fantastic. But, you don't drive a car by looking out the back window, do you? You have to look in the front. So those are the sort of things I enjoyed. And also been able to get results. I worked with colleagues, and actually, even though the immigration role was quite forefront, always is, and it can be quite a strong debate. I've actually been able to engage constructively with a lot of colleagues across the House on individual cases. People like Stephen Timms, who very different views to me, but really very thoughtful, immeasurably polite when he dealt with you. That made him really, really difficult to deal with because he was so polite. He was so gracious in anything. Oh, this is harder to say no than the person just having a party political rant. We can say, right, well, thanks for that. And here's a quick reminder of what your party did or stand for or voted for, and see you tomorrow. Vroom, and sit back down again. So those are the sort of things. And, enjoyed it. It was interesting. I'd like to have done a little bit more time at transport. I think there's a lot of debates around our rail system, how it delivers to passengers in cost and terms, and also staffing and what investment we have in future. And I don't really think the period of Mr. Sunak's administration did anything about those, and I'm not really sure at the moment Labour's answering many of those questions of, just nationalising something that's pretty much 2/3 nationalised already is not going to fundamentally change how our railway systems work and operate and what they cost. So those are the sort of things, just a bit of a fresh and flavour. And yeah, the Whip's office was entertaining, but not quite as entertaining as Simon Hart's book would have you believe.
Before we come on to perhaps your views on your take on the state of the Tories today. Last year's election, and I promised Chris that I wouldn't like too much. Obviously, you lost your seat to a Liberal Democrat, but how
you had to say that, didn't you?
I just had to. Give me my moment, But how soon prior to the election did you realise you weren't going to win, or was it actually a shock on the night?
I think I knew about a year before that we had challenges, and they were there. We'd done very well in the Torbay Council elections, but we actually gained. Torbay was one of only 2 Conservative gains in May 23. But we detected that certainly, unlike a lot of others, it was obvious the Conservative Party had become unpopular, arguing. Mr. Sunak, it was becoming very clear he didn't really have any coherent vision at all. There was nothing there. The King's speech showed that dramatically later in the year. When the highlight thing you're talking about is pedicabs, it rather tells you that for a new Prime Minister, well done for getting there, but what was it you want to get there for? And I think Nadine Dorey's letter, perhaps if she had a little bit of personal reflection as well, actually a lot of it hit the nail on the head. Where was this great agenda you were desperate to treat the country to? So we knew it was a while. And we were out canvassing for a local by-election, just after, which was on the 6th of June. And we've been out canvassing for the PCC elections, where the Conservative Party actually did very well in Torbay. We were well ahead of the Lib Dems by some distance. And we were then out canvassing, that's fine. And then it was like a light switch. The moment, basically, the National Party and Mr. Sunak came on the ballot paper when he called the election, it flipped over. And very different feel on the doorstep. And that's when we probably realised things different. Also, reform coming up, particularly after, can I say it, Mr. Sunak's pretty ill-judged and actually quite shocking and shameful behaviour on the 6th of June and his rather mealy-mouthed apologies that followed. And then the icing on the cake that we knew we'd done was when, if you remember, I'm conscious we'll have to be quite careful what we say on this, but the gambling scandal that, again, involving some of Mr. Sunak's close associates, that, again, he utterly failed to deal with until a lot of us put a lot of pressure on him. And basically, I think he realised that even in the midst of an election, we were getting close to a lot of us saying, well, if you cannot even deal with this, it's time for you to resign. But sadly, that it is what it is. Politics. Adrian Sanders would have thought he cut up quite rough in 2015 after 18 years of service, and he got done in by Nick Clegg. I suspect. I knew how he felt on the morning after the election. Thank you, Mr. Sunak and Mr. Dowden. Thanks for all the great work you did. Don't come back.
Well, I have to say, at a lower level, I also know, because I lost my borough council seat in 2015.
Of course, yeah.
And I blame that totally on Mr. Clegg, because I think I've been a pretty good councillor, So yeah, I mean, sometimes the things are out of our hands, aren't they? In terms of the Conservatives today, then, I mean, it's not looking great, is it?
No, we're drifting. We are struggling to get into the conversation. I think actually, Mathew, I could gently say the Lib Dems have a little bit of that problem as well. So after this week, that you look at some really big issues out there at the moment, and it's Reform, Labour, perhaps even the Greens there. What breakthrough is either the Conservatives or the Lib Dems having, who, let's remember, just over 10 years ago were in government together. So, serious parties who control still a good chunk of local government. I think Kemi's strategy of sort of have 2 years diagnosing problems and analysing solutions has not worked. And it's just left a vacuum that has been filled by Reform. And about a year ago, it's worth noting, actually, we weren't that far behind Labour. In fact, I think the day Rishi Sunak stood down, was the first poll of his entire period of leadership, rather ironically, that actually put the Conservative Party ahead in front, only by 1 point. But, to be fair to him, when he left, that had happened. And I think there's a lot of questions. We've got the conference coming up. I certainly think Kemi needs to be a lot clearer about what she actually believes. No one is expecting a manifesto like in detail. The government isn't going to tell us what's in November's budget. So, no one's going to expect the Shadow Chancellor to stand there and read out Budget 2029 either. But there is a need for a much more concerted effort. And I voted, I can't say, but I voted Robert Jenrick. I didn't see Kemi as being a potentially successful leader, and I think that's probably how it's turned out.
Chris?
I would agree with that, and indeed Mathew will know that I've been saying similar things really ever since we restarted the podcast in March about Kemi needing to get into the media and say things. And I understand, okay, you might not want to announce policies in detail and so forth, but even if you look at Cameron's kind of early few months, again, Cameron's form of conservatism isn't my form of conservatism, but he did define what kind of conservative he was. He went to Svalbard, he did all the speeches about sort of going green and that kind of thing. And Kemi has a really good sort of personal story to tell, which she's not telling. And you're right, she's just completely left the space for Farage to not only overtake her, but cement Reform in that position as the default right of centre party now. So, what kind of things would you like to see now? Given that the Tories are, their poll position, is not good at all. What would you like to see at conference? What would you like to see in terms of sort of next steps? In terms of strategy and so forth.
I think you're right. You're right to say Cameron had a very good strategy from the off, and he didn't announce Budget 2010. What he did do was talk about vote blue, go green, talked about changing on socialist attitudes, moving the Conservative Party away from opposing, for example, same-sex marriage, to saying it would actually legislate for it, those sort. And it's a different submove. But similarly, he didn't sit there and say, and I'll spend 0.3 billion on this and 0.2 on that. Right. So he did start to move the conversation on quite significantly. And also, by the way, we were the undisputed second party. It was clear that, you know, the discussion of the Lib Dems in the 90s overtaking us and becoming the second party had ended by that point. It was clear who the challenger would be at the next election. So we did have that advantage, which Kemi probably has less of at the moment.
Yeah.
So what does we need to do? What does she need to do? First, I think it's core principles. What do we actually believe in? You know, it's the sort of secure borders, it's sound finances, it's safe streets, it's those sorts of things. Put out what are your clear top priorities and principles. Forget the silly rows about Twitter tickers and what type of lunch you have. All very interesting.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, just
Right.
of no interest to anyone. That is not going to determine who governs this country after 2029. So those are the things. What are your core principles and beliefs? You probably need to have a couple of policies that demonstrate that. So, for example, on secure borders, I know Mathew will probably faint on this one, but it is going to be things like you will bar claims under the Refugee Convention, under modern slavery, from those arriving via small boat into Dover and who are detected leaving a safe and democratic country to do so, and almost certainly, at the very least, severely restricting the application of the ECHR, if not leaving it completely. So because that is your theory of secure borders. I believe borders should be secure and sovereign. Therefore, ability to use international law to ignore them to come from France anyway, I will do it. So those sorts of things. Secure finances speak for themselves, and that does mean you have to resist the urge to be talking about every spending pledge you might ever want to make. To be fair, actually, Mel Stride is doing a pretty reasonable job with a lot of that. Actually, one of the few areas where we have made up grounds on Labour and others is on the economy. And a lot of that's Mel being, you know, in a different way to Rob Jenrick, I'll come on to in a sec, out there a lot, speaking to people, working the patch, talking, being in the media, being a very visible presence, and across the country. You know, I've had him visit Torbay to talk to a business affected by the inheritance tax changes. He's doing that. Now, the other person who's showing how it can be done is, of course, Robert Jenrick. Core principles, some good, strong messages, enforcing the law, traditional law and order stuff, but presented in a more modern way, i.e., TikTok, social media. You know, the number of people rushing to buy a morning newspaper is massively down on where it was even 10, 15 years ago. So you need to find new ways of connecting that out. But it's still some good core messages there. That's a lot of what Kemi needs to do over the conference week. We don't need a conference like she had last year where we had a vague slogan being explained from the stage and a week saying that's not what I really said on maternity pay. There needs to be some clear stuff. And I think George Osborne summed it up well on a podcast recently where, you know, a little bit less time on things like transgender toilets and a lot more time on the economy.
So can I ask you, you know, who should the Tories be mainly targeting? Because they've got this thing, haven't they, where they've obviously got reform to their rights, but also you lost scores of seats to the Liberal Democrats, and you know, obviously from my point of view, I hope that they win scores more off you next time. So can you fight both battles, or do you have to choose?
I think you can't be all things to all people, Mathew, but let's look at Torbay, for example. Conservative vote, plus half the Reform vote, plus about 10% of those who voted in 2019 and didn't vote in 2024, and the Lib Dem MP loses. And there's plenty of people like that, with actually very little Labour vote left in those seats, or Green vote to be squeezed. It's virtually all been squeezed. But you've got a big Reform vote, and in some, you know, and a really sizable Conservative vote that put together would very easily outnumber the Liberal Democrats. That's the point. Now, I'm not saying that means you just go wholehearted down the sort of Reform style, you know, try and completely Trump or stuff like that. You know, there are still going to be, what's the sound finances? What are our plans for economic growth? You know, we are still generally a party that believes in more open trading and open economies. That case also needs to be made as well around, you know, the arguments about becoming a closed economy and putting tariffs on, why that wouldn't work. Actually, by the way, Mathew, one you and I as more economically liberal would agree on. Those are the sorts of things that we need to remember in, you know, the arguments on immigration, crime, is that there's also that key economic piece that goes on as well, which does differentiate us a bit from Reform, and particularly around sound finances and money as well. So I don't see them as wholly exclusive battles, but if we go into this pact of being all things to all people, that ain't going to work. Secondly, I think this election is going to be a different one coming up, Because actually, for both Labour and the Conservative Party, it's going to be about appealing back, drawing back vote you've lost, a lot of which was your core and your base vote over previous decades, more so than the transfers between parties. Because there wasn't a big shift from Conservative to Labour in the way there was in 1997, where people definitively said, right, I voted for John Major in 1992, I'm voting for Tony Blair this time. It's a very different battle.
Absolutely.
I think that.
Yeah, Chris? Sorry.
Yeah, and I would agree that the analysis has to be different. There's lots of talk about sort of appealing to centre grounds and so forth. It's a different landscape now, so there has to be a more sort of sophisticated, updated strategy for today, as opposed to just looking at what happened 20 or so years ago and repeating that. It's different now. It's a completely different landscape.
Yeah. And I think also, Mathew won't mind me saying it, it's also, I think, for the Liberal Democrats as well, one of the things they've got is they've got to actually start showing some results for having 72 MPs. Yeah. And the marching band this week, for me, just sort of summed it up. Come on, what's the thing? Whereas Paddy Ashdown, a similar position, was in constitutional reform talks with Blair, was actually someone shaping political discussion and narrative in this country, as did Charles Kennedy. Great call on the Iraq war with all the things thrown at him at the time of being unpatriotic, not supporting the troops. Actually, he could say, well, look where strategically I put us in terms of against a neocon ideology of intervention in the Middle East that we can all debate whether that was good or bad. But generally, most people would say, actually, Charles Kennedy got it right. So I think that's for the challenges in a nutshell for the parties.
I absolutely agree. And you've led us very nicely onto our discussion of the politics of the week. So we're going to start with reviewing Lib Dem Conference. Very rare, I can tell you, Kevin, that the Lib Dems are not left to the very end of the pod. But I think Chris, who, bless him, as well as everything else, kind of helps in discussion with me, obviously, sets the agenda for who we're discussing and in what order, bless him. So he normally puts the Lib Dems at the end, but we're at the top this time, so there you go. Then we're going to come on to reform and immigration policy, and then we're going to come on to digital ID and the Labour conference preview. So that's what we're going to be doing. So in terms of Lib Dem conference then, well, obviously I was there for 2 days, Saturday and Sunday, and I should say at the start off that I really enjoyed it. It was great to catch up with friends and colleagues, old and new. I'm sure all of us in our respective parties, think of ourselves as a bit of a family, and I certainly do with the Lib Dem. So it's always great to see my Lib Dem family. And I was very active for the almost kind of not even quite 48 hours that I was there. I did a speech on youth services, one of my big issues. I chaired Dignity in Dying Springs, which was really good. Interviewed by ITV, all sorts of things. So I enjoyed my time at conference. It was great. However, in the conference bubble is one thing. Outside of the conference bubble is quite another. And I kept having to, and obviously, I was then back home Monday and Tuesday when the conference was still going on, and I was just amazed by how little our conference was being talked about. Now, there's two sides to that. Do I think that the media should be covering us more, especially as the third largest force in the Commons in a century? Yeah, I absolutely do think that. But do I think that we make ourselves very easy to ignore? Yeah, I absolutely do think that. I think we're eminently ignorable. And I don't think that was the case, under Paddy Ashdown or under Charles Kennedy. And I have a lot of time for Ed Davey. He achieved our best ever result last year, 72 seats. Fantastic. But I do wonder, maybe that no other Lib Dem members would agree with me on this, but I do wonder if this conference was, and I don't think it'll happen anytime soon, but the kind of the beginning of the end of Ed Davey's leadership. I mean, when I saw the marching band thing, cringe was not quite the word. I just thought to myself, if this is what we're having to do to gain attention, then I'm really worried for us as a party. And I said to, without discussing kind of private conversations that I had at conference, I spoke to lots of people from, ordinary members, councillors, members of the House of Lords, MPs, others. And what I put to them, all of them, was, what are we saying? What are we saying? What of note are we saying? Lots will be said at this conference, lots of policy debates, all very important. I took part in one or two of them myself. Great. Great for members, fab. But what are we saying that is breaking through beyond the conference building? And I hope my fellow Lib Dems will think that I'm not being unfair when I say that, very little was being said. I mean, I liked Ed's speech. I like the fact that, he set us as and I think this was strategically sensible, set us as the anti-Farage, anti-reform party. I think we absolutely need to be that. I quite liked his line, we've got Trump's America doing what Farage is Britain. I quite like that. So, in his speech, which was, I guess, well, I was going to say it was the main thing that would be seen, but actually it happened to be that when he was speaking live, so also was Donald Trump speaking live. I'm sure he did it just to frustrate Lib Dem Conference.
Absolutely, yeah. Been his diary for months to do it, yeah.
Yeah. And so, almost all of the blooming news channels switched over to Trump's speech, which I get from a news perspective.
Quite right.
But yeah, thanks, Chris. But it was obviously, really frustrating from a Lib Dem perspective. So I don't even know how much his speech got through either. So I mean, a bit of a weird thing, really, in that I really enjoyed conference. It was fantastic. But externally, in terms of what the public saw or heard, it was probably just the marching band thing. And then also, although I know you two would no doubt disagree with me on this, but another thing that I personally found cringe, and I'm sorry, I just did, I'm going to be honest, was, Tim Farron's patriotic bit when, they got all of the flags to come out, and that didn't sit well with me and many of the Dem members either. So I mean, what can I tell you? I mean, I should just point out that I had great chats with Josh Babarinde, who's a presidential candidate and is a future. If you want to know a future leader in the party, Josh Babarinde is the guy, our MP for Eastbourne. I met up with Dick Newby, our former leader in the House of Lords, had a great chat with him. And I even got to meet, if that's the right word, the Premier League trophy. So that was had a wonderful conversation with it. But that was fab. So my conference was great. But Kevin, if I can ask you, I don't know how much of it you got to catch Lib Dem Conference, but I mean,
I was hooked.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Yeah, but I mean, anything positive that you can take from what you saw, or not really?
Oh, I think in some ways, Mathew, you've highlighted, I think some of the challenge for the Lib Dems is if you're still having to do stunts when you've got 72 MPs, right. Yet meanwhile a guy with, 5 can capture the entire national media with one press conference, you've got to start asking yourself some questions. And what did I remember of the Lib Dem conference? Here's what I remembered. First, the band. Second, the rather entertaining moment and Trump's dominated, we can't let Trump, and now we're going over to Donald Trump. That was rather entertaining. The third one was the Glee Club singing Tony Blair Can and Die. I thought that was rather interesting, given, of course, a lot of people back in the 90s in the Lib Dems quite liked Tony Blair, I thought. And then the final one was Ed Davey wants to cut welfare, apparently, which is rather interesting, given what the Lib Dem spokesperson on that's been saying to anyone who'll listen for most of the last year. So it was, for me, it was a weird one because what do you actually need to be doing? Well, what the argument? What are you winning these seats for? What are you looking to do? Other than it's nice to have a job. You can employ your friends. You can do some tweets. You can go to some nice events and all this, that, and the other. What is your purpose in politics? It was very clear for a few decades. The Lib Dems were the party of in. You were the party that believed in Britain being more as a European country, more following European social democratic trends and other things. From that was where you very much saw Britain positioning. You're saying you don't want it to be more positioned like a sort of more of a 52nd state style, you know, looking towards the US. Okay, get that. But what is the vision? I think, Mathew, you alluded to it, is there are some openings in politics. Youth. There's plenty of under 40s who don't really think the country works for them. Okay, so has the Lib Dems got anything on that? Or is it about objecting to every single housing development in the entire country?
Right.
They could have been talking, which, you know, great, and it's beaten some Conservatives. Well done. And I hope when people retire from their career, they can have a look back and think of the housing list, where it was when they started and where it was when they finished, and just have a think whether they had a role in that. Then the next part of that is what is your view on economy, trading links? There's vague talk about some sort of deal with the EU to be sort of in the customs union. Well, what does that mean? You know, join the EEA again? Something like that? You could be a bit more bolder in that. There is still a constituency of people, probably more than about 10% of this country, who don't agree with the position that I would espouse, that, look, we had the referendum, we've had that debate, let's move on. There could be a constituency there for saying, actually, we should be closer to Europe. Now, that means some people won't vote for you. You might lose seats like Torbay. But would that actually mean that you'd be driving much harder a Labour Party that itself, a lot of its MPs think we shouldn't have left? I think that's where things, is this just about getting jobs, numbers, winning more seats? Brilliant. But then that means at some point you will get another coalition. And at that point, you'll collapse and it will all go to nothing again. And I think that's where I think you're right to point a little bit, Mathew, to potentially be the end of Ed, is if you actually got government, what do you think Ed would actually do with it? And I think that's the problem. Because if you do get that opportunity after the next election, which even if you look at the polls today is possible, then if you don't have a clue what you're actually going to do with it, you'll find the electorate will be quite unforgiving the time after.
So before I just come to Chris for his take on the Lib Dem Conference, which we all can't wait for, just to respond to, because I think, you know, I should on a couple of points. I mean, I broadly agree with you, Kevin, but just on a couple of points there. I mean, look, you know, because I'm one of the saddos that watches BBC Parliament a lot, you know, our MPs are raising all sorts of issues. And in Parliament, you know, I think
demanding tax cuts one week, more spending the next. Yeah, it's great. It's brilliant fun.
Oh, that's opposition for you, isn't it? But you know, they you know, I think they're a hardworking team, and I know many of them, and I know that they would say that they worked hard. The question is whether any of that goes beyond what people actually see. For most people who, you know, are interested in politics, but who perhaps watch the evening news each night, or whatever it is, or, you know, is any of that breaking through? And I don't think that it is. I also hear, and I mean, you know, these things are always difficult to prove, aren't they? But I also hear that, I mean, one of the reasons why we don't see more Lib Dem MPs, you know, doing the broadcast media stuff and everything is because there is Ed's people, and there are people who are not Ed's people. And the people who are not Ed's people are kind of frozen out of being given opportunities. Now, maybe that's the case for all party leaders, that they have their people who they put up and those that they don't. But, you know, I mean, without retreading old ground, because we talked about it last week when we had Peter Cardwell on from Talk TV, you know, he speaks of a time when they actually wanted to have a Lib Dem MP on and praise the Lib Dems, which is very rare on Talk, bless them. Could they get the press office to provide anyone or even respond to them? Not at all. No, they couldn't. So we're literally missing opportunities. And I do wonder if we're missing those opportunities because no one from Ed's people were available to go on. If that's the case, then, you know, I don't think that is good enough. But I agree with you. I think what the trouble is, Kevin, is that we're scared poopless, if I can put it that way, of upsetting potential Tory to Lib Dem voters. And so, whereas I'd love us to be, and I know that you two would disagree with me on this, but I hope you'd see that from my perspective, why I think this, I'd love us to be unashamedly kind of pro-immigration. Not suggesting that there shouldn't be some kind of system, but unashamed in saying, you know, this is why immigration is important to this country. You know, I'd love for us to be pro the needing of, you know, housing to be built, and especially affordable housing. I'd love to be making that argument. I'd love for us to be unashamedly, you know, pro LGBT plus rights, as we should always be as a liberal. Party. I'd love for us to have a kind of Jeb Bartlett moment, and for Ed to really stand up and say what we believe. And would we lose some voters over that? Yes, we probably would, but people would know where we stand. Instead, what we do is this thing where we daren't quite say what we stand for. And so we're left with this mush in the middle.
I think it's interesting. Sorry to just jump in, but the thing you make me think of, Mathew, is the SNP had the vast majority, all but at one point, all but three, of Scotland's MPs for the thick end of a decade. When you start actually thinking, what did they actually achieve? Yeah, they did a lot of shouting. They, drank the bar dry a couple of nights. But it's actually quite hard to really nail down differences they made with that position. Beyond making sure pledges of extra devolution that were made in the referendum before 2015 were delivered. Okay. Whereas you look at Jo Swinson, who's much maligned in your party, for 11, 12 MPs? And she very, very nearly overturned the Brexit referendum. Very, very nearly. Now, people look her through the prism then what happened in the 2019 election. That was her misjudgment. She didn't quite realise how that would work out, and that voters' views had shifted, that the referendum had to be respected. She came very close, very close. And for me, you contrast that and then say, okay, so in a few years' time, when people look back, if Britain, I think, will leave the ECHR, I suspect we will have a migration policy more similar to Australia. And by the way, I suspect a lot of that will be delivered by the Labour parties, rather surprisingly for a lot of people. But, I suspect that'll happen. When Ed looks back at the bungee jump and maybe having 80 MPs, the question will be, well, okay, great, mate, brilliant. Glad you had a good time. But actually, come on, show me what you achieved. And I think Paddy Ashdown and Charles Kennedy could answer those questions. Even Jo Swinson could show what she tried. She tried. This is what I tried to do. What's the answer? Apart from I beat some Tories. Great. Good luck with that, mate.
Chris?
Yeah, I think Kevin sort of sums everything up very well. And I would like to echo the point about kind of what it is, Mathew, your party, or who is your party trying to appeal to? Are the same people you think you're going to get by waving the flags are going to be impressed by your policy on Gaza? Or it was your economic policy. We mentioned it was confusion about welfare policy. Now, what's your welfare policy? There's also at conference, if you want serious media attention, not the kind of jokey sort of media attention that Dave is trying to get, then there has to be a serious sort of policy direction or policy announcement, and I didn't get any of that from the last week. The last thing I'd like to say about this is your for Mathew is your attack line, and you were very strong against Nigel Farage in particular. You used a lot of heated language about him. He's a threat to democracy. He's going to loosen gun controls. I don't know where Ed Davey got all that from. He's going to turn Britain into Trump's America, and so forth.
I liked all that.
I mean that kind of
that was some of the stuff I liked.
But the thing is, it's basic. But the thing is, it's the Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris sort of personal attack line, which failed against Trump. And is that really going to succeed against Farage? Yes, he's a Marmite figure, but was Ed Davey over the top in terms of some of the fact that he's a threat to democracy? We talked about language, was it last week or a couple of weeks ago on this podcast, and he's using language like that. And is there a more sophisticated way he could attack Farage in compared to what he did this week?
Well, also, I thought it was also interesting to note that, yes, he did mention Labour and some of what they were doing, but he didn't mention Keir Starmer once, and ultimately we're in opposition to the present government as much as anything else. And I know that Chris often makes the point. I don't always agree with him on this, because I think when you're in the third place spot at PMQs, you can't really just repeat what the Tory leader. It's the Tory leader's job, and as Chris will admit, Tony Bednott doesn't always do this, but it's the Tory leader's job to just, whatever the most political thing is, to just absolutely nail the government. That is their job as the Tory leader. I don't think that's necessarily the job as the third party leader. I think you can do something a little bit different, but ultimately, the people that are in government currently are the ones that you're ultimately having to go at, because they're the ones able to change stuff. And so I do think we need to do more of that. I want to come on to paying tribute to Ming Campbell, and actually it feeds into what we were just saying, because Ming Campbell famously said, who sadly his death has been announced today at 84, I believe. Ming Campbell said, I think when he was Lib Dem leader, caution will not do. Safe pair of hands, yes, but ready to challenge orthodoxy. And I think he's absolutely right about that. I think Lib Dem should never be happy with the status quo. We should be wanting things to be better from our perspective, and we should be setting out clearly what our point of view is. Just before we come off Lib Dem Conference, and I'll say a few more words about Ming Campbell. I believe, Chris, that we've got a video that I recorded especially for this podcast, a little exclusive from Lib Dem Conference, which I know that you've all been. I mean, Kevin only came onto the pod so he could see this.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So this was me at Lib Dem Conference exclusively for Political Frenemies.
Hi folks, so it's Matthew. I'm here at Liberal Democrat Conference in Bournemouth, where, I am getting my hair cut. So, hello, what's your name?
Hello, Mila.
And who are you here representing today?
Movember.
Movember.
Of the men's health.
Yeah, so absolutely, mental health is a big issue for all of us. It's absolutely a big issue for men. We tragically know the numbers in terms of men under 50 that are taking their own lives. So it's really great to have the Movember folks here at Party Conference. What can I say about conference in general? Folks seem pretty happy. Lots of important issues being debated. I spoke on youth services yesterday from the conference platform. I chaired a fringe meeting earlier today on dignity in dying, the assisted dying legislation, which was fantastic. But I'd also say the conference is a bit of a bubble, and there's lots of great and important things being said in the conference. But what are people hearing outside the conference? Is our message cutting through? And I do worry that it's not at the moment. And so my message to my party, for what it's worth, is be bolder, be braver, and be louder. Cheers.
So there we are. So that was a little exclusive recording from me at Lib Dem Conference, and it was great to see the Movember people there, because men's mental health is a really, really important and really serious issue. I was very sorry to hear about Ming Campbell's death today. I know he's been unwell for quite a while, and has really not been himself since the death of his late wife, which I know really affected him. He was a titan in the Liberal Democrats. He, liberal to his fingertips, and I've been thinking today that he's kind of an example of a politician that we don't necessarily see very much of today. I'd argue that almost from like a past era, that kind of a very classy person. And yes, he held his views very firmly, but he was always very fair-minded as well. I think it's a great shame that he was never the Foreign Secretary. I think he would have excelled in that job. For Foreign Affairs and Defence, he was fantastic on. He was one of the main people behind us opposing the Iraq War in 2003, which, as Kevin quite rightly said, was a very brave decision by him and by Charles Kennedy. I think people think today that it was the natural position to take, but actually at the time they received a lot of flack for that. And I can also point out that there was a lot of internal debate within the upper echelons of the Lib Dems about whether that was the right thing to do. So I think him and Charles really had to fight their corner for that to be our policy. I just think very sad news that he's departed the scene, Kevin.
Yeah, he met Ming a few times. Didn't serve in the Commons together, but obviously he was in the Lords. You can best describe him as a statesman. He was someone who believed in statecraft, who would passionately argue his position. Yes, his time as leader perhaps wasn't the best, but many of the attacks launched on him were, said more about the people actually launching the attacks rather than Ming himself. And I think we've seen him in the RAF club a few times as well. But no, genuinely decent man who served the country well. And here's the thing, Matthew, I'd always thought he's someone who actually, if Labour had just been slightly less partisan, well, some of my guys would have made an excellent speaker.
That's true. Oh, he absolutely would have done. Do you want to say anything on Ming Campbell, Chris?
Yeah, again, very, very sad. He was active and I think leader during the time when I was working in Parliament. So I did get to see him in action. And yes, he was a person of substance. He was a person of weight. He was a person with particular expertise, so foreign affairs and defence. And we need more people like that with that kind of sort of expertise and that kind of respect. Yes, his in some respects that didn't necessarily serve him well when he was leader, because I think he struggled to make the transition from policy to domestic policy by the time he was leader. But although I do think he was past his peak at that point as well, but he did steady the ship after Charles Kennedy resigned, and he did pave the way for Nick Clegg and to take the party in a direction where it would end up in the coalition with the Conservatives, which I know Mathew might not necessarily agree with, but he was in that sense he was a good transitional leader, but he was, his thing was foreign affairs, and he was, although I disagreed with a lot of what he said, he was very well respected in that regard.
And you're absolutely right in saying that he was a transitional leader. I mean, people will remember that very sadly, Charles Kennedy had, who I still think is the best ever leader of my party. If anything, I'm a Kennedyite in the Lib Dems. I just thought he was great. But he, had his problems obviously towards the end of his leadership. And so Ming Campbell came in, and I mean, Ming was there to steady the ship before then handing on to Nick Clegg, and we won't talk about what happened after that. But and I should just say that though I never met Ming in person, and it's funny thinking about interviewing Kevin, 20 years ago, I did interview Ming back when I was at the station. Before I went on, they were all stations in the same radio group. And so before I went to Kicks 96 in Coventry, where I used to interview Kevin, I was at what was the Bear 102 in Stratford-upon-Avon. And I did a down the line thing with Ming Campbell, who was up in our patch, or who was going to be coming up to our patch, and talked about his candidature to lead the Lib Dems. So I did get to interview him. I can't tell you any great story from that. It was just a 2 or 3 minute interview where we talked about his ambitions to lead the Lib Dems. But it was good that I got to speak to him. I think that's the longest we've ever done on the Liberal Democrats on this podcast. So we better move on, otherwise Chris will explode. So let's move on to Reform UK then, and talk about their week. So another big week for Reform. What week isn't a big week for Reform these days? So let's start, Kevin, with what they were saying on Monday, one of their many Monday press conferences, which dominate the media agenda, on what Farage was saying on immigration and indefinite leave to remain. Obviously, you were an immigration minister. You know this issue as well as anyone else. Is what he was saying sensible or not?
I think the core of what he was saying is, should welfare, now particularly now we're out of the EU and there's no reciprocal things going on, be available to non-British citizens? That's a fair debate. I can probably agree with his point that you shouldn't come into the country and then within few years be able to find yourself on welfare paid for by the British taxpayers more widely. Yeah, I think where this went quite wrong was a bit like we've seen with some other things. Big, bold statement with a big number. So we said 234 billion in savings, which the CPS, who we effectively report he lifted it from, said that's not right. You shouldn't be using it in that way. But we see this Monday, the big, bold statement, and then the clarifications come. Of course, the first clarification was that they wouldn't be revoking indefinite leave to remain from those protected by the post-Brexit agreements. There's about 4 million EU nationals living in the UK who are fundamentally protected by that. And by the way, they're 2/3 of the foreign national claimants of universal credit. So that rather blows a hole in the plan for some savings. Then after that came, I think Hong Kongers and Ukrainians might now be exempt. I predict the next one will be the Windrush generation, because actually getting them to go back through applying for status, many of whom viewed themselves as part of the British family and nations when they came here back. And we're talking people who arrived before 1989. So, we're going back to some years. I think that's where it just said to me, and it's a pattern we've seen, particularly with Zia Yusuf before, of big statements that then, once they're actually analysed and it becomes quite clear, actually, have you looked at some of the detail of this? For example, they didn't appear aware that the Ukrainian routes are not routes to settlement. You don't get ILR after 5 years on the Ukrainian routes, because the idea is the theory of the Ukrainian routes is that you are coming here for temporary refuge, and then you'll go back to Ukraine to help rebuild it after the war. And people say, is that the British government view? That's the Ukrainian government's view. They don't see the solution to the Ukrainian war as evacuating all Ukrainians for very obvious reasons when you think about it. So the detail didn't seem to have been done. And I think the issue when you get into suggesting that people who've been here decades should reapply, as opposed to saying what you think the policy should be going forward from the day you've said it, and then finally, you'll still be able to do this if you're a British citizen. Well, I suspect we're going to see a pretty record number of applications from people from ILR to shift on to British citizenship in the next couple of years. And again, that didn't seem to be thought about at all.
Chris?
Yeah, I think those are fair points. I think again, we've been talking about this over various weeks on the podcast about the professionalisation of the party, and still, I think this is still evidence that still the party needs to mature. It needs to, it needs to develop that kind of policy depth and expertise, which it doesn't seem to have at the moment. Although in saying that, in terms of the other parties, they usually announce sort of party policies, and then it sort of unravels in the days afterwards as well. So is reform really as unique as perhaps you might expect? And there's perhaps another question stemming from this, and that is, although it's embarrassing, it's obviously the reform needed to clarify the detail and so forth. Given that we're this far out from an election, given that I think most people would expect that policies at this stage would be first drafts as opposed to final versions, does the fact that reform has got the detail wrong at this stage, does it really matter? Or is all that matters at this stage that the public ultimately sees, reform is going to bring down the numbers, and it doesn't, the detail doesn't necessarily, the exact number doesn't necessarily matter at this stage, but we know what Farage stands for. We know that he has the intention to bring the numbers down considerably. We know he has a wider plan in relation to the ECHR and so forth. So in that sense, yes, the Westminster bubble was making a big deal out of the detail, making a big deal out of his other statements as well with regards to swans and so forth. But
come on to those in a moment.
Like with Trump. Is it just the thrust of the message that's more important here, rather than get hung up on whether this detail's right or not? Or am I reading too much into this?
No, Chris, I think your general thrust is that does detail matter? Yes, it does if you then go on to actually implement the policies concerned. But as you say, general election's still 3.5 years away. Farage is looking for mood music, so to speak, to be very much behind him. And also, both Conservative and Labour have got this, and certainly Nick Clegg's Lib Dems had it as well, you said all this before an election, and then we saw what happened next. And how can Nigel Farage be any worse? I mean, that's some of what's driving this. Is people thought they were going to get something fresh and different with Keir Starmer, all these problems just happened to be the fault of the Conservatives. The moment they were in, WASPy women were going to get compensation, the economy was going to boom, everyone would have a house, and people are now looking, saying, well, he weren't very good. Well, surely this guy, he can't be any worse, can he? And I think that's really what... So, does it matter? Yeah, of course it does. If you believe in serious politics, you actually want to plan to implement some of this stuff. But for their objectives at the moment, no, it doesn't. They got what they wanted. They got the whole media talking about that Nigel was going to only have British citizens claiming welfare and didn't really need to go much further than that. Sounds good. Why would I want to object to that? We can sit here and think of all the issues if you're actually a government trying to put that in.
And does it surprise you, Kevin, when, again, obviously not someone of my politics, but when quite serious people like Danny Kruger are leading the Tories to go and join Reform?
Yeah, it's interesting. I must say, I think if Danny had been doing that policy on Monday, a lot of the points I picked up, Danny would have made sure there was answers to. He'd have known what to say about the Belfast Agreement and people who can identify as British, Irish, or both, all those sorts of things. He would think. I think it is a concern for the party when we lose people who've got talents and skills. I wish Danny all the best. I've messaged him. I'm not going to join the silly little attacks on social media on him. If you thought he was a great bloke the Monday morning, then you can't really say you thought he was lazy and useless a few hours later. So it's, for me, there is big, but it probably comes back to what we said earlier about, there needs to be a Conservative leadership that's much more focused on, well, what is it you want to do? Sending out surveys asking me to problem diagnose. Well, okay, great, brilliant. But, lead people reactive vision to where you want to take the country. Mathew, you hate it, but other people love it, the Farage vision. Ditto, people like Charles Kennedy had a vision. People didn't like it. You loved it. Other people didn't like it. It's that, where are the goals? Blair had one. Cameron had one. And at the moment, it's very obvious Keir Starmer doesn't. It's been interesting to see Andy Burnham setting his stall out this week. So I think that's the issue, is the Conservative Party, what are we here for? What are we looking to, I'll take from you, from my party, the criticism I've just given about the Lib Dem Conference, about, what you're looking to achieve with all this.
Absolutely. And in terms of, I was listening to another podcast the other day, and they were talking about, how much Farage thinks he can get away with and whether he can or not. I mean, the fact that he didn't, when he was on LBC the other day, robustly come out and say, I do not agree with Donald Trump on this whole thing about paracetamol and autism. There's no proof that there's any link between those two things. The fact that he said, well, I don't know. Science is never settled. I don't know. I mean, I know he's in with Trump's crowd, but why is he doing that? Because we don't have those same, thank goodness, we don't have yet at least those same kind of, sets of public opinion. Most people will think, unless they're really down the rabbit hole, in which case they can't be saved anyway. But I think most British people, don't think there's any connection between women taking paracetamol when they're pregnant and autism. So why is Farage equivocating?
Yeah, I think first, most people in this country, Mathew, would not come to me, or let's be honest, any of us, about medical care. They'd go and speak to someone who's qualified in it, and I think that would have been quite an obvious rebuff line for Nigel to say. Just say, well, guys, I'm not a doctor. This guy, I'll leave that to medics, and then try and move on quickly. But he decided to go in and very much sort of bat for sort of defending Donald Trump saying it, which is an odd strategy because, yes, there's a lot of people who might respect the way Trump is, knows what he thinks and he's America first and all that. Most polls don't show huge amount of support for some of the policies that flow from that in this country. And it was an odd one. It's a bit like, if you remember earlier this year, when Trump was saying things about trying to get peace in Ukraine, and Nigel sort of started equivocating a bit on the war and Yeah, and he said, he made a fair point. Wouldn't we all like to see peace? But then didn't really follow it up with, but it can't be at any price, and you cannot reward aggression because, to be fair, he always says the biggest mistake of the 20th century was the peace, the armistice in 1918. Realistic was the peace in 19. Well, you can't really say that and then repeat those sorts of mistakes in another context years later. So it was an odd one. For someone who's usually quite a good communicator, he was a bit, battling off a bit. It was one where, for him, I'd have just said, I think your whole priority here, mate, is to move on. Because actually, people don't vote for their MP normally on the basis of what their medical opinion is. They'll talk to their doctor for that, and then they'll ask you about how much you want to fund the health service.
Well, quite. And then you had the weird thing of Dr. David Bull, who is a medical doctor, went on to be a Talk TV presenter, etc., and is now the Reform chairman, but who was a medical doctor, going on TV and saying there is no connection between these two things. And then obviously Farage had said what he'd said. So it just makes me wonder if beneath the surface of reform, I know they try and show a united front, but you do just wonder. I'd love to be a fly on the wall sometimes at some of the discussions that take place after some of these things have been said. Because, I suspect there's probably quite a lot of tension behind the scenes.
There are tensions there. Certainly those I know who have gone over to reform. There's very rarely any of them say much good about Zia. They're all quite complimentary about Nigel, and I've met Nigel. They say, what you see in public is what you see in private. He's mission focused. And they'll say, Richard Tice can argue so, and they'll be complimentary about a lot. But Zia, and I've had one or two of them say to me, if you want to know what the biggest threat to reform doing well at the next general election is, it's something done by Zia. And that's where they feel there are tensions in there. If you remember when he resigned and then came back, there's just a sense there, yes, there are arguments there. And I think also on some of the councils where they'll be starting to do budgets, Mathew, having been a councillor, I know it, having been a councillor and MP, you have to start telling people, okay, guys, well, we've all had 10 different ideas. Which 3 of them do we want to go with? That's when you start to see potential fractures emerge if you haven't got a clear sense of where you're going, what you're doing. But, there are tensions there. But it'd be a bit like the SNP. They were very vocal, and they could be very vocal on lots of stuff at Westminster because they didn't actually have to take a decision on it. And they had that uniting vision of, we want Scottish independence, and that will sort all these problems out.
Yeah, so it's just what you said about Zia Yusuf. He's very good in the media. He's very good doing sort of question time and things like that. But he does have a habit of shooting his mouth off, especially on Twitter, and that causes the party into difficulties. But I also think it goes back to professionalisation because normally in a political party you would sort out your lines in the early meeting, whether it's a 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock meeting, and that's where all the lines are sorted out, and then they're passed through through the email systems and so forth. That doesn't seem to be happening at the moment with reform, and again it's another case of they're still in their early phases and they still need to mature a bit.
Yeah, well put. Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Absolutely. I think that's quite enough on reform. Let's turn to the Labour Party. As I always say, currently the ones who can actually get stuff done because they are the government. This whole thing about digital ID, it's one of the few things, surely, isn't it? It's one of the few announcements or policy positions that has seen united against them, the Greens, the Lib Dems, because we feel it's a liberal kind of nonsense, reform. That takes quite something to get those 3 parties united in opposition on a particular policy, right?
Yeah, I had to take a double take, realising I was agreeing with Zara Sultana on something. And Jeremy Corbyn. And I'll speak. I could give all the reasons. I'll spare you than what I've been saying in other media. But as a former immigration minister, this will make absolutely no difference whatsoever to the issues relating to illegal migration into this country. I think it was interesting, though, as we said on Wednesday, I think Ed Davey, though, said something about how there was arguments to look forward, although I notice now the Lib Dems come out and say, saying we'll fight it tooth and nail. So there was just that slight
I,
little
thi-
wobble.
I
there
think
in the
I
middle of the
think
week.
I think members made our views very clear during conference.
Yeah, and to be fair, Matthew, I think something similar has probably happened to Kemi Badenoch, who I think last night said there was arguments for and against, and this morning popped out. We launched a petition again, no to digital ID. So that tells me probably how those internal discussions went promptly after some of the tweets went out. So no, it is, and I think it's because, people say, well, public like this idea. Well, yeah, if you tell someone, should we introduce this to stop the boats in the channel? Oh, yeah, that sounds good. Whereas if you ask them, should we introduce a requirement that, if your grand's just walking down the high street, we should be able to stop her and check her ID? Oh, well, no, why would you do that? And if the argument about getting jobs, well, it's already a requirement to check immigration status. In fact, in the first quarter of this year, £41 million worth of fines were issued to employers who were found to have had workers who didn't have status. You're supposed to do it. So they're not. So to be clear in Keir's mind, they're not complying with the idea if they're asked to check a passport or a visa, but they'll definitely comply if it's a digital ID card. Yeah, right. Other arguments include that it'll stop people taking cash-in-hand jobs. Well, hang on. If they're already ignoring the rules on taxes, they ain't going to pay much attention to this one either. So, no, it is interesting. And I think it's really pernicious is where this could go. Because if it's argued about for immigration, if it comes in, then law enforcement will start trying to tackle it around immigration. Well, we can guess how you might profile walking down a street or doing certain enforcement work, how that might go. Then give it a couple of years. There'll be a bit of a hue and cry that parliamentary committees looked at the statistics around who's being checked for their digital ID, and it presents a rather predictable story involving communities African, Caribbean or Asian heritage. There'll then be a big outrage on that, and they'll balance it up by the three of us being stopped or being checked for an ID thing or what those sorts of areas. This is where some of this ends up. And I say to people who say, oh, it might be good to stop and go, say, okay, I went, remember the Digital Safety Act was going to stop kids watching porn? Now we've got police popping around about hurt feelings. Really? So how do you know this doesn't end up outside at the asylum hotel? It's not the residents having their ID checked; it's the protesters outside. How would you feel about that,
Chris?
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that. It just seems that the Labour Party, from my perspective, especially from a Conservatives perspective, is just coming out with the greatest hits of the worst policies possible. I mean, you've got the Chega surrender, you've got the recognition of Palestine, you've got the farm tax, and now you've got this, and it's just another policy which again the rationale behind it isn't particularly clear, and what it's actually going to do practically on the ground. Again, that hasn't been explained, and again, it's another policy which seems to be unravelling a little bit, because Darren Jones, I think, said this afternoon something about government IT systems being rubbish. So basically undermining the whole point of this sort of big central database.
Project. Yeah.
There's questions about what's going to happen if you're checked and you're found not to have the ID. And Lisa and Andy said, well, we're not going to punish you, but you're not going to get a job, and so again, it's
carrying a plastic card. But hang on, that means carrying your phone instead.
And the other thing, what happens if you have your phone nicked as well? And you checked.
I think there's kind of it is interesting that the three or four parties are united against it, obviously for very different reasons. My opposition to it is because I'm a liberal and I think it's illiberal. I don't oppose it because of the whole migration thing. But it's interesting that despite whatever our reasons may be, we've all found reasons to oppose this policy. As we head into Labour conference, it's interesting, isn't it? They're only just over a year into government. You'd think that conference would still be fairly jubilant, and yet I have to think that it's going to be more like a wait at Labour conference. I mean, they've had sort of the and yes, I am going to mention these two words, sort of the Liz Truss aberration for a government that has lasted any length of time. I mean, this government has had the worst start that I can remember. And, I've been watching politics since I was about 14, 15. I'm now 45. I've been watching politics for a long time. And I can't remember a government go down the pan as quickly as this one has. So, I mean, you've got to think, Kevin, that, I'm sure they'll try and put a brave and smiley face on it, but they're not going to be happy campers, Labour conference.
No, they're not going to be happy campers at all. And it's even worse, actually, than what happened between 92 and Black Wednesday and then the Conservative Party, winning that election. But even then, you could say the Conservative Party had, by that point, been in government over 13 years. So, it had a good run. We're not a few months. It's really been quite weird. But a lot of that's because, perhaps winding back to our conversation about David, there's been no real preparation for going into government. Numerous pledges made with no real attempt to row back on stuff. And just a sort of assumption that it would all be all right on the night. And I think they're going to be quite downbeat. They got absolutely smashed in the early local elections earlier this year. They're probably going to get absolutely whacked in Wales and Scotland next year as well. And that means losing real power as well. And they've actually got an overt version of what's going on behind the scenes. They've got Lucy Powell versus Bridget Phillipson. In reality, it's a cover for Andy Burnham versus Keir Starmer.
Yeah, just and the weird thing about this is that they're announcing their sort of what seems to be a flagship policy for the conference at a different conference, because this was announced at the international sort of progress conference or whatever it was called. So I'm not quite sure, not quite sure why or why. I assume sort of the difficulties with McSweeney might have something to do with it. And it seems like they've run out of ideas, and the big idea that they had is a policy that was voted down in 2005, like 20 years ago.
But Chris, what you're not realising is the influence that Tony Blair and his foundation apparently has on this. And Tony Blair, if I can put it like this, has got religion. He's got religion on the idea that technology and AI, especially, is the answer to every single thing. And some might suggest, of course, far be it from me, but some might suggest that's because of who funds the Tony Blair Institute. But I'll go no further than that on that. But Tony Blair, indeed. But Tony Blair is having apparently a kind of outsized influence on this government, and because he's caught religion on this thing, this is what is constantly dripping into the ears of those that are running this Labour government. So. And I mean, I think AI will be great for many things, but I also think it will be a threat in terms of many things. I think you've got to have a rounded view on AI, but that is the reason, Chris, why that is happening. I think.
So I totally agree with a lot of that. Also, this government's got a sense of, with a lack of any great driving vision, you've now got a really big Labour majority, sort of casting round, trying to find things to use it on. And you've ended up with pet projects. Now, whether you agree with them or not, you'd say, for example, the abortion law changes. That wasn't really something that was particularly debated in the law, but suddenly pushed in, Labour's big majority used. You could say that a little bit on assisted dying. We are on different sides of that argument, Matthew. But again, it's the sort of thing where you're looking at them sort of casting round for stuff. And this is now the latest one that's come forward. Yeah, they can drive it through with their big mandate, but I just wonder how many of them are going to look back in about 5-6 years' time, a bit like Aspie said, Conservatives are doing at the moment, about 2019, and say, guys, we had an absolutely once in a generation opportunity there, and Tony Blair brought the minimum wage in. Attlee used it to create the NHS and the welfare state. Things that have then carried on. A couple of things I've just listed there have carried on to this day from 1945. Labour landslide. What's our legacy? We twiddled about with ID cards, which then got boffed off by the next government. We did some stuff that sounded all very interesting and really wasn't very relevant, and then left off the back of a load of anger about issues and potentially, in their view, let in a government that was diametrically opposed to everything we stood for. So what a great 4 years that was. That's where I think the pressure on the leadership comes.
Well, quite. And just on that, so give us your view then, Kevin. I mean, do you think? I mean, I first suggested to Chris in the first season, so going back many months now, that people were speculating even back then that Starmer was going to go in 2026, and we both at the time said, "Oh, we can't see that at all. He's just been elected Prime Minister." But I just wonder. I doubt that he'd go over his own. I doubt you don't just tell him resign from being Prime Minister, do you, particularly? But I do wonder if there will be a challenge. The question is Andy Burnham brave enough to stop being Mayor of Greater Manchester, to try and find a parliamentary seat, to have the Labour NEC allow him to look for a seat? That's one thing as well that's probably out of his control. And to say explicitly, which I think he'd need to do at some point pretty soon, the reason I am doing this is to challenge Keir Starmer for the Labour leadership. That doesn't seem very Andy Burnham-esque to me.
No, I think, do you know what? Well, remember, he was in core group jellyfish, if you remember that argument during the various Labour leadership trials. Do you know what? I think Andy Burnham, that could end up as a disaster for Labour, because look at the seats they're casting around. They were talking about Andrew Gwynn's. Well, OK, but Andrew Gwynn only got 50% of the vote, but it was his vote dropped at the last general election. How pleased would voters in Tameside be, given recently Labour lost, I think, its safest council seat in a by-election there? Actually, it went to Reform, massive swing, big enough to take Andrew Gwynn's seat, I think, as well. And then you've got to look at other seats that Reform might not be competitive in a by-election in Greater Manchester, but in sort of places a pro-Gaza independent might go down quite well. Again, what's Andy going to be doing there? And against the backdrop of electors being forced to go to the polls because of a row in the Labour Party. That's the recipe for an absolute disaster. So I think the Andy Burnham one, for me, is a bit more of a putting a pressure for an agenda. Do I think Starmer will survive to 29? No. I think Burnham's probably the one that's up there pushing, and it could then come in at the next general election on the back of a disaster, say, look, guys, if you'd listened to me, we would have been much better positioned. So, hello, I'm here now. I'm ready to be your leader. I think where it would be another Labour, someone who's actually already in there because of the issue with the by-election. And, of course, then have to have an election for Mayor of Greater Manchester with Lib Dems, Conservative, Green, Reform and everyone else pointing out how much that's costing because of the Labour Party's problems. It's someone in. I always think the kernel of the Angela Rayner story was a hit job from the Starmerites that went a bit far. Can't prove it. I'm sure some of their lawyers would probably be quickly on to me if I went further down that track. But it just struck to me, and then finally finished off with some research from the Conservative Party. But I cannot see Labour MPs if next year's elections are a disaster, because they'll run in Wales and Scotland, particularly Wales, they'll run all the stories about the NHS, about public services, because those are what the devolved DAs really do, is the running of services like the NHS. And if all the stuff about Nigel and the NHS doesn't work in Wales, how on earth is it going to work across the whole of the UK? Right. That's going to be, and that's the moment at which I think becomes very dangerous for Keir Starmer, is if you can't even win in Wales against Nigel Farage, how on earth are you going to win, potentially against a new Conservative leader, potentially even against Boris Johnson, never rule him out. How are you going to turn this around in 2029? And I think that's where the real danger for Keir comes. I do not see Keir Starmer being the Labour candidate for Prime Minister at the next general election. I think you were right, Matthew. I think he'll go next year.
So but who is going to challenge him, though? Because, if we're ruling out Andy Burnham for the moment, and unless something, does happen with that, and it might, you think of other people like Wes Streeting, and it's interesting that he's popped up a couple of times this week, being quite, and he's a very good communicator, whatever you think about it. But he's set to, unless something changes, and it might, we're years away from a potential election, but unless something changes, he's set to lose his seat. And so are Labour going to want to elect a leader who may well lose his seat at the next election? So I guess the question is, as weak a position as Keir Starmer is in, who is there to actually challenge?
Yeah, you're right. Although, if you'd said, in 1988, who's going to replace Margaret Thatcher? Who'd have said John Major?
Right.
It's, there's you've got those sorts of things. Sometimes people can burst out a bit. And I do look at some of the ones who've come in. You've got Shabana going in as Home Secretary. Quite interesting to see how she's changing Labour, particularly the reach out on some of the stuff on immigration. That's it's not stuff you may like, Matthew, but it's the sort of thing that might well resonate with the voters Labour's lost. I think you can certainly write off Rachel Reeves. I think if Starmer goes, she goes. But they're seen as equally culpable for what's happened since Labour came into government. As you say, there's people like Wes. I've noticed how pro-Palestinian Wes has come recently. Wonder why that is. Yeah, didn't remember him being amazingly pro-Palestinian, but he is now apparently. Wonder why. So there is those threats, but I just can't see them if they get absolutely smashed, particularly in Wales. I can't see Labour MPs wanting to carry on for much longer in that way, in the same way as if she's still in office in May, if it's very poor for the Conservative Party in Scotland and Wales. Similarly, I think that, if she hasn't already gone by that point, you could well see that would be, I think, it's actually a bit like with Brexit, you could see pressure on both main party leaders to go.
Well, just on that,
I think.
Sorry, no, go ahead, Chris. Sorry.
No, I think Mahmood is a good shout. Actually, that's a good bet. But I said the same thing about Priti Patel, and then a month later she resigned. So you can take my word for it or not.
For Labour, she ticks the box as well if they haven't had a female leader or a BAME leader, where the Conservative parties had four female leaders and 2 BAME leaders. It doesn't matter so much for us, but it does for Labour.
Indeed so. And I mean, when I see some of these polls, and some polls suggest that, it's going to be Reform as the biggest party and then the Lib Dems in second place. I can't quite allow myself to kind of believe that. But do you think that that for Labour and the Tories, this is potentially existential in terms of a crisis for both of them?
If we do nothing, if we ignore it, if we think it'll all go away and voters will get it right when the big one comes round, it will be. The one thing we've got is time. We've got 3.5 years. We've got time. And that means, I think, difficult decisions in both the Conservative and the Labour Party. Labour Party will be looking at its parliamentary party, probably more its front bench, how they're performing. The Conservative Party will be looking at its nearly 120 MPs and saying, how are they performing and what are they doing? So I think there is time there, and that's the one thing. And, there's a party we haven't mentioned that was perhaps very relevant in this discussion. It's called the SDP. 50% in the polls. Cruising local elections, you know what came next. Indeed.
Absolutely. Kevin, it's been such a joy to have you on. And it just makes me smile that, there we were kind of almost literally 20 years ago, wasn't it? You were city councillor, me a roving reporter, and I used to enjoy our interviews, and it's just great that we're able to have this chat in different guises, kind of 20 years on. Really appreciate you taking the time. It's quite a big thing for us as a growing podcast to have a former MP and a former minister on. So we really appreciate it, don't we, Chris?
No, thanks for that. It's been really good. I've really enjoyed it. Really appreciate your insights, and again, thanks again for making the time to be with us.
Yeah, no problem. Enjoyed it, and as I say, it's been a great reunion of sorts with Mathew.
So Kevin, thanks so much, folks. Look, thanks for watching and listening. Please do all the internety things. Please like, please subscribe, please follow us over on Twitter X at Political Frenemies. Please tell your friends, all of that stuff. We're getting some fantastic numbers, which we really appreciate. So thanks for all of that. And so from Chris, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.
And from me, it's goodbye. We'll see you next week here on Political Frenemies.